Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Mike Peterson began loading his kayak onto the roof of his weathered SUV. The cool, salty breeze ruffled his graying hair as he methodically secured the straps, his movements practiced and efficient. After years of similar mornings, "You're really going out there today?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of worry as she stepped out onto the driveway, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. Mike paused, turning to face his wife of 25 years. Her brow was furrowed with concern, a look he'd grown all too familiar with lately. "Come on, Sarah. You know how long I've been looking forward to this trip." Sarah sighed, taking a sip from her mug before responding. I know. It's just, did you see the news last night? There have been more shark sightings off the coast. They're saying it's unusual for this time of year." Mike chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Sharks live in the ocean, honey. It's not exactly breaking news." He walked over to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I've been kayaking these waters for over a decade. I know what I'm doing." "That's what worries me," Sarah muttered, leaning into his touch despite her reservations. "You get so caught up in the fishing, sometimes I think you forget about everything else out there." Mike's expression softened. He knew his wife's fears weren't entirely unfounded. The ocean could be unpredictable, and he'd had his share of close calls over the years. But the pull of the open water, the thrill of the catch, it was something Sarah had never fully understood. "Look," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I promise I'll be extra careful today. I'll stick closer to the shore, okay? And I've got my radio if anything happens." Sarah nodded, not entirely convinced but knowing she couldn't dissuade him. "Just come back to me in one piece, all right?" Mike grinned, leaning in to plant a quick kiss on her cheek. "Always do, don't, Si?" He glanced at his watch, his excitement building. "I better get going if I want to beat the crowd to Ledbetter Beach." As Mike finished loading his gear, Sarah retreated back into the house, unable to shake the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. She watched from the kitchen window as he pulled out of the driveway, the familiar sight of the kayak strapped to the roof, doing little to ease her anxiety. The drive to Ledbetter Beach was short, the early morning traffic in Santa Barbara still light. Mike hummed along to the classic rock station, his mind already out on the water. He pulled into the parking lot, relieved to see only a handful of other vehicles. Perfect. He'd have his pick of launching spots. As Mike unloaded his kayak and gear, he noticed an older man walking along the beach, metal detector in hand. The man paused, watching Mike with interest. "Heading out for some fishing?" the stranger called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. Mike nodded, smiling. "That's the plan. Hoping to catch some halibut, maybe a few rockfish. If I'm lucky." The old man's expression turned serious. "You might want to reconsider, son. There's been talk of a big great white hanging around these parts lately. Fishermen have been spotting it all week." Mike felt a flicker of unease, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the calm waters before him. "Appreciate the warning, but I'll be all right. Been doing this for years." The man shrugged, turning back to his metal detecting. "Suit yourself, just thought you should know." Mike watched him walk away, a seed of doubt trying to take root. He shook his head, banishing the negative thoughts. He wasn't about to let some local gossip ruin his day out on the water. With practiced ease, Mike dragged his kayak down to the water's edge. The sun was higher now, its warmth beginning to cut through the morning chill. He took a deep breath, savoring the briny scent of the ocean. This was what he lived for. As he pushed off from the shore, the familiar rush of excitement coursed through him. The gentle lapping of waves against the kayak's hull, the cry of seagulls overhead. It was a symphony he never tired of hearing. Mike paddled steadily, his powerful strokes carrying him further from the beach. He kept an eye on his depth finder, watching for the drop-off where he knew the fish liked to congregate. The water was calm, almost glassy, reflecting the cloudless sky above. About a half-mile out, Mike decided he'd found the perfect spot. He could still see the shoreline clearly, which would hopefully ease Sarah's worries when he told her about the trip later. He settled in, preparing his fishing gear with the practiced motions of a seasoned angler. As he cast his line into the cool blue depths, Mike allowed himself to relax fully for the first time in weeks. The pressures of his job, the constant stream of bad news on TV, it all melted away out here. It was just him, the kayak, and the vast, mysterious ocean. Time seemed to slow as Mike fished, the sun climbing higher in the sky. He'd caught a couple of decent-sized rockfish, enough for a good dinner later. But the real prize, a big halibut, still eluded him. It wasn't until mid-morning that Mike noticed something odd. The school of smaller fish he'd been tracking on his depth finder suddenly scattered, as if spooked by something. He frowned, peering into the water. It was probably nothing, maybe a seal or sea lion hunting, but then he saw it. A dark shape, much larger than any seal, gliding effortlessly beneath his kayak. Mike's heart rate spiked, his mouth going dry. No, it couldn't be. Not here. Not now. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. It was probably just a shadow, a trick of the light, on the water. But deep down, in the primal part of his brain that recognized danger, Mike knew better. His hands shook slightly as he began to reel in his line. Maybe it was time to call it a day. He'd caught enough fish, and suddenly the open water didn't seem quite so inviting. As Mike was securing his rod, a movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. About 50 yards away, a seal burst from the water, its sleek body arcing through the air before crashing back down with a splash. It was fleeing from something, terror evident in its frantic movements. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he saw what followed. A massive dorsal fin, at least 2 feet tall, sliced through the water with terrifying speed. It was heading straight for the panicked seal, and Mike's kayak was directly in its path. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Mike's mind raced, years of safety briefings and wilderness training battling against raw, paralyzing fear. He knew he should move, should try to paddle away, but his body refused to obey. The great white shark, for there was no doubt now about what it was, closed the distance with frightening speed. Mike could only watch in horror as the massive predator breached the surface, its enormous jaws clamping down on the fleeing seal with bone-crushing force. The impact sent a spray of water, and blood into the air, snapping Mike out of his paralysis. He grabbed his paddle, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He had to get out of here, had to get back to the shore, back to Sarah, but it was too late. As Mike dug his paddle into the water, he felt, rather than saw, the shark's approach. There was a moment of absolute stillness, the calm before the storm. Then, with a sound like a freight train bursting from the depths, the great white slammed into Mike's kayak from below. The world tilted crazily as Mike was thrown into the air, a scream tearing from his throat. The last thing he saw before plunging into the cold, unforgiving ocean was the shark's dead black eye, ancient, remorseless, and utterly without mercy. The waters closed over Mike's head. One thought burned through the chaos of his mind. Sarah had been right. He should have listened. And now, as he fought to regain the surface, terror clawing at his chest, Mike Peterson realized he might never get the chance to tell her that again. Mike's paddle sliced through the water with practiced precision, propelling his kayak further from the shoreline. The gentle swells lifted and lowered him in a rhythmic dance, a sensation he'd always found soothing. But today, something felt off. An inexplicable unease had settled in the pit of his stomach, refusing to dissipate despite the familiar surroundings. He paused his paddling, letting the kayak drift as he scanned the horizon. The sun hung higher now, its rays glinting off the water's surface. To the casual observer, it was a perfect day for kayaking. Yet Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. "Get a grip, Peterson," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "You're letting Sarah's worries get to you." As if in response to his words, a school of small fish suddenly darted beneath his kayak, their silvery bodies flashing in the sunlight. Mike leaned over, peering into the blue depths. It wasn't unusual to see fish, of course, but their behavior seemed frantic. He reached for his fishing rod, thinking he might as well take advantage of the situation. As he baited his hook, a dark shape passed beneath the kayak, gone almost. Before he could register its presence, Mike froze, the fishing line dangling, forgotten from his fingers. What the hell was that? His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the shadow. The water's surface remained calm, betraying nothing of what lurked beneath. Mike tried to rationalize what he'd seen. It could have been a large fish, maybe a tuna or a school of smaller fish moving together, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered a different possibility. "No," he said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the open water. "No, it's not. It couldn't be." He forced himself to resume fishing, his movements more mechanical now, less fluid. The joy he usually found in the activity was overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. Every splash, every ripple in the water sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. As he cast his line, a movement to his right caught his attention. About 50 yards away, a seal surfaced, its sleek head bobbing above the waves. Under normal circumstances, Mike would have found the sight charming. But there was something off about the animal's behavior. It seemed agitated, its movements erratic. "Hey there, little fella," Mike called out, more to calm his own nerves than anything else. "What's got you so worked up?" The seal let out a sharp bark, its eyes wide with what Mike could only describe as fear. Before he could process this, the animal suddenly dove, disappearing beneath the waves with a violent splash. Mike's heart rate spiked. He'd seen enough nature documentaries to know what often followed a fleeing seal. His eyes scanned the water, frantically searching for any sign of a dorsal fin. "Okay, Mike," he said to himself, trying to keep his voice steady. "Time to head back, nice and easy, no sudden movements." He reached for his paddle, his hands shaking slightly. As he dipped the paddle into the water, preparing to turn the kayak towards shore, something bumped the underside of his craft. It wasn't a violent impact, but it was deliberate enough to send a chill down Mike's spine. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own pounding heart. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The bump came again, stronger this time. Mike gripped the sides of his kayak, knuckles white as he peered over the edge. The water was too murky to see clearly, but he could make out a massive shape circling beneath him. "It's just curious," he told himself, trying to remember what he'd read about shark behavior. "It's just investigating, stay calm, don't panic." But panic was already setting in, clouding his thoughts. The shore seemed impossibly far away now. Had he really paddled out this far? He needed to move, to start making his way back. But fear kept him paralyzed. A dorsal fin broke the surface about 20 yards away, cutting through the water with terrifying purpose. Mike's breath caught in his throat. It was massive, far larger than he'd imagined. This was no curious juvenile. This was an apex predator, ancient and powerful, and Mike was in its domain. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Somebody help!" Me, but he knew it was futile. He was too far out for anyone on shore to hear him. The few other boats he could see in the distance were specks on the horizon, their occupants oblivious to his plight. The fin disappeared beneath the waves, and for a moment all was quiet. Mike held his breath, straining his ears for any sound, his eyes darting across the water's surface. The silence stretched on, seconds feeling like hours. Then, without warning, the water exploded around him. The shark breached the surface, its enormous body launching partially out of the water. Mike caught a glimpse of rows of razor-sharp teeth, a black, lifeless eye and glistening grey skin, before the beast crashed back down, missing the kayak by mere feet. The impact sent a wave crashing over Mike, drenching him in cold seawater. He sputtered and gasped, clinging desperately to his kayak as it rocked violently. "No, no, no," he chanted, a mantra of denial in the face of the nightmare unfolding around him. "This isn't happening, this can't be happening." But it was happening. The shark circled back, its fin cutting through the water once more. This time, closer, much closer. Mike could see the scars on its dorsal fin, battle wounds from a lifetime of hunting in these waters. He fumbled for his paddle, his numb fingers struggling to grip the smooth surface. He had to move, had to at least try to make it back to shore. Sitting here, paralyzed with fear, he was nothing more than easy prey. As he dipped the paddle into the water, the shark made another pass, this time bumping the kayak hard enough to nearly capsize it. Mike let out a strangled cry, more animal than human as he fought to keep his balance. "Leave me alone," he shouted at the circling predator, his voice raw with terror. "Just leave me alone." But the shark, driven by instincts honed over millions of years of evolution, paid no heed to his pleas. It was in full predatory mode now, testing its prey, looking for weakness. Mike paddled furiously, each stroke fueled by pure adrenaline. His muscles burned, his lungs heaved, but he pushed on. The shore was still so far away, but he had to try. He couldn't die out here, couldn't leave Sarah alone. The thought of his wife waiting for him, worrying about him, gave him a burst of desperate energy. The shark, seemingly irritated by the movement of the kayak, intensified its attacks. It rammed the craft from below, the impact lifting the front of the kayak clear out of the water. Mike cried out as he was nearly thrown from his seat, only his white-knuckled grip on the sides keeping him aboard. As the kayak slammed back down, Mike caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A small fishing boat was approaching, its occupants waving frantically at him. "Help!" he screamed, waving one arm above his head. "Over here! Help me!" For a moment, hope surged through him. Maybe he would survive this. Maybe he'd be able to see. Sarah again to hold her, to tell her how much he loved her. But then the shark struck again, this time with devastating force. Its massive jaws clamped down on the rear of the kayak, shaking it violently. The sound of crunching plastic filled the air as the shark's teeth easily punctured the hull. Water began to pour in through the breach, and Mike knew with sickening certainty that his kayak wouldn't stay afloat for long. The approaching boat seemed to be moving in slow motion, too far away to reach him in time. As the kayak began to sink beneath him, Mike locked eyes with the shark. Its black, soulless gaze held no malice, no anger, only the cold, implacable drive to feed. In that moment, Mike understood with perfect clarity his place in the natural order. Here in the vast, unforgiving ocean, he was no longer the apex predator. He was prey. The last thing Mike saw before slipping into the cold, dark water was the shark circling closer, its massive form blocking out the sun. As he plunged beneath the waves, a single thought echoed through his mind. Sarah had been right. He should have listened. And now, as the ocean closed over his head and the shadow of the great white loomed ever larger, Mike Peterson realized he might never get the chance to tell her that again. The world exploded into chaos as the great white shark breached the surface, its massive jaws clamping onto Mike's kayak with bone-crushing force. The impact sent him flying, his body arcing through the air in a moment of surreal weightlessness, before crashing into the cold, unforgiving ocean. Mike plunged beneath the waves, disorientation and panic consuming him. The salt water burned his eyes and nostrils as he thrashed wildly, desperately trying to regain his bearings. Which way was up? Where was the shark? These questions pounded in his mind as he fought against the urge to gasp for air. Finally, his head broke the surface. Mike gulped in great lungfuls of air, coughing and sputtering as he treaded water. His eyes darted frantically across the choppy surface, searching for any sign of the monstrous predator that had attacked him. "Help!" he screamed, his voice hoarse and cracking. "Somebody help me!" But his cries were swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. The shore, once a comforting presence, now seemed impossibly far away. Mike could see a few distant figures on the beach, oblivious to his plight. A flash of movement caught his eye, his overturned kayak bobbing in the waves about 20 feet away. Without thinking, Mike began to swim towards it, his strokes frantic and uncoordinated. It was his only hope of survival, a floating lifeline in this watery hell. As he neared the kayak, a dark shape glided beneath him. Mike's heart leapt into his throat as he realized the shark was circling back. He redoubled his efforts, arms burning. As he pushed through the water, just as his fingers grazed the slick surface of the kayak, something slammed into him from below. The force of the impact lifted Mike partially out of the water, a scream tearing from his throat as he felt the rough skin of the shark brush against his leg. He scrambled onto the overturned kayak, clinging to it like a lifeline. The plastic creaked ominously under his weight, and Mike realized with growing horror that the shark's initial attack had severely damaged the hull. Water was slowly seeping in, and he knew it wouldn't stay afloat for long. "Oh, God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh, God, please, no." The shark circled closer, its dorsal fins slicing through the water with terrifying precision. Mike could see now just how massive it truly was, easily 20 feet long, its girth as wide as a car. This was no juvenile testing its boundaries. This was an experienced hunter, and Mike was squarely in its sights. "Stay away," Mike shouted at the circling predator, his voice cracking with fear. "Leave me alone." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The shark, driven by instincts honed over millions of years of evolution, paid no heed to the desperate cries of its prey. It continued to circle, each pass bringing it closer to the foundering kayak. Mike's mind raced, searching for any scrap of information that might help him survive. What had he learned about shark attacks? Should he play dead? Fight back? The conflicting advice swirled in his head, useless in the face of pure primal terror. A sound caught his attention, the distant rumble of an engine. Mike's head snapped up, eyes scanning the horizon. There, about a quarter-mile away, was a small fishing boat. Hope surged through him, giving him a burst of desperate energy. "Here!" he screamed, waving his arms frantically. "Over here, help me!" The boat seemed to turn in his direction, and for a moment, Mike allowed himself to believe he might survive this nightmare. But then the shark struck again. Its enormous body surged out of the water, jaws agape, aiming directly for Mike. He threw himself to the side, nearly sliding off the kayak as the shark's teeth snapped shut mere inches from his leg. The impact sent a shower of water over him, momentarily blinding him. As Mike blinked the salt water from his eyes, he realized with horror that the shark's attack had further damaged the kayak. It was sinking faster now, water pouring in through multiple breaches in the hull. "No, no, no," Mike chanted, a mantra of denial in the face of his impending doom. He looked back towards the fishing boat, which was now close enough for him to make out figures on deck. They were waving, shouting something he couldn't hear over the pounding of blood in his ears. The shark circled back, its black eye fixed on Mike with cold, predatory focus. He knew he couldn't stay on the sinking kayak, but the thought of entering the water again, of being so exposed and vulnerable, sent waves of paralyzing fear through him. "Come on, Mike," he muttered to himself, trying to summon any last reserves of courage. "You have to move, you have to try." With a deep breath, Mike slid off the kayak and into the water. The shock of the cold ocean sent a jolt through his system, adrenaline surging anew. He began to swim towards the approaching boat, each stroke a desperate plea for survival, but the shark wasn't done with him. Mike felt the water displace behind him, a surge of movement that could only mean one thing. Without looking back, he took a deep breath and dove beneath the surface. The underwater world was a blur of blue and gray, bubbles streaming past Mike's face as he swam with all his might. He could feel the presence of the shark behind him, an immense shadow pursuing him through the depths. His lungs began to burn, screaming for air, but Mike knew that surfacing too soon could mean certain death. He pushed on, arms and legs pumping furiously, driven by the pure animalistic will to survive. Just as he thought his lungs would burst, Mike broke the surface with a gasping breath. The fishing boat was closer now, close enough for him to hear the shouts of its occupants. "Hang on," a voice called out. "We're coming." Mike turned to look at the boat, hope rising in his chest. But that momentary distraction cost him dearly. The shark, with timing honed by eons of hunting, chose that instant to attack. Its massive head burst from the water, jaws wide, aiming directly for Mike's torso. Time seemed to slow. Mike saw every detail with horrifying clarity. The rows of serrated teeth, each as long as his hand, the black, lifeless eye rolling back. In its socket, the countless scars that marred the shark's gray skin, testament to a lifetime of violent encounters. In that eternal moment, as the jaws closed around him, Mike's thoughts turned to Sarah. Her face flashed before his eyes, her voice echoing in his mind. "Be careful," she had said. "Come back to me." The pain and regret of failing her, of leaving her alone, was almost worse than the physical agony that exploded through his body. The shark's teeth sank into Mike's side, its powerful jaws threatening to cut him in half. He screamed, a primal sound of pain and terror that echoed across the water. Blood blossomed in the ocean around him, turning the blue waters a sickening crimson. The shark began to shake its head, its instincts driving it to tear its prey apart. Mike felt himself being pulled under, the sunlight growing dimmer as he sank into the depths. His vision began to darken at the edges, consciousness slipping away. Just as he thought it was over, that this was how Mike Peterson would meet his end, something changed. The pressure on his body suddenly released. Through the haze of pain and encroaching darkness, Mike realized the shark had let go. With the last of his strength, he kicked towards the surface. His head broke the waves, and he gasped for air, each, breath-sending waves of agony through his mangled body. The fishing boat was there, so close he could reach out and touch it. Hands grabbed him, pulling him from the bloodied water. As he was hauled over the side, Mike caught one last glimpse of the ocean. The great white's fin cut through the crimson-stained waves, circling once before disappearing into the depths. Mike collapsed onto the deck, his vision tunneling. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him was a gruff voice saying, "Jesus Christ, call the Coast Guard." This guy's barely alive. As the darkness took him, Mike's final thought was of Sarah. He had survived against all odds. He would see her again, and this time he promised himself he would listen. The fishing boat's engine roared as it raced towards the shore, cutting through the waves with urgent speed. On the deck, Mike Peterson lay in a growing pool of his own blood, his body racked with pain and shock. The two fishermen who had pulled him from the water worked frantically to stem the bleeding from the massive wound in his side. "Stay with us, buddy," the older of the two men urged, pressing a wadded-up shirt against Mike's injury. "Coast Guard's on the way. You just gotta hang on a little longer." Mike's vision swam in and out of focus, the pain threatening to drag him back into unconsciousness. He tried to speak, to thank these men for saving him, but all that came out was a weak groan. "Don't try to talk," the younger fisherman said, his voice tight with stress. "Save your strength, we're gonna get you to help." As the boat sped towards land, Mike's mind drifted. He saw Sarah's face, heard her voice warning him not to go out on the water. The memory of her concern, so casually dismissed that morning now, filled him with bitter regret. The sharp blast of a horn cut through Mike's haze. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement, to see a Coast Guard vessel pulling alongside their boat. "We've got a shark attack victim," the older fisherman called out. "Male, late 40s, severe lacerations to the torso and leg." Everything became a blur of motion and noise. Hands lifted Mike onto a stretcher, the movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. He cried out, unable to contain the pain any longer. "It's okay, sir," a calm voice said near his ear. "We're going to take care of you. Can you tell me your name?" Mike struggled to focus on the Coast Guard medic leaning over him. Mike," he managed to gasp. "Mike Peterson." "Good, Mike, you're doing great," the medic said, her hands moving quickly as she assessed his injuries. "We're going to get you to the hospital now. Just try to stay awake for me, okay?" As they transferred him to the Coast Guard boat, Mike caught a glimpse of the ocean behind them. The water was calm now, deceptively peaceful, but he knew the danger that lurked beneath the surface, the primal terror that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The boat's engine roared to life, and they set off towards the shore at top speed. Mike gritted his teeth against the pain as the vessel bounced over the waves. The medic worked steadily, inserting an IV and applying pressure bandages to his wounds. "Sarah," Mike mumbled, his thoughts again turning to his wife. "Someone needs to call Sarah." "We'll make sure she's notified, Mr. Peterson," another Coast Guard officer assured him. "Right now we need you to focus on staying conscious. Can you tell me what happened out there?" Mike closed his eyes, the memories of the attack washing over him in vivid, terrifying detail. "Shark," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Huge. Came out of nowhere, capsized my kayak." The officer nodded, jotting notes on a clipboard. "Can you estimate the size of the shark?" Mike's mind flashed to the moment the great white breached the surface, its massive form blocking out the sun. 20 feet, maybe more. Biggest thing I've ever seen. A low whistle came from one of the other Coast Guard members. "That's a monster, all right. You're lucky to be alive, sir." Lucky. The word echoed in Mike's mind. Was he lucky? He was alive, yes, but at what cost? The pain in his body was overwhelming, and he knew the road to recovery, if he survived at all, would be long and difficult. As they neared the shore, Mike could hear the wail of ambulance sirens. The Coast Guard boat slowed, carefully maneuvering into the harbor. Through his fading vision, Mike saw a crowd gathered on the dock. Onlookers, medical personnel, and... was that Sarah? Sarah! He called out, trying to lift his head. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him, and he fell back with a groan. "Easy, Mr. Peterson," the medic cautioned. "We're almost there. Your wife will be able to see you soon." The boat bumped gently against the dock, and a flurry of activity erupted around Mike. He was lifted onto a waiting gurney, the medic rattling off his condition to the paramedics who swarmed around him. "Mike! Oh my God, Mike!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. He turned his head to see her pushing through the crowd, her face pale with shock and fear. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," a paramedic said, trying to block her path. "That's my husband," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Please let me see him." Mike reached out a shaking hand towards her. "Sarah," he managed to say, his voice weak. "I'm sorry, you were right. I should have listened." Sarah grasped his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Don't talk like that. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay." The paramedics began to move the gurney towards the waiting ambulance. "We need to get him to the hospital now," one of them said urgently. "You can ride with us, ma'am, but we have to go." As they loaded Mike into the ambulance, he kept his eyes fixed on Sarah. The pain was becoming unbearable, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision, but he fought to stay conscious, clinging to the sight of his wife's face like a lifeline. "Stay with me, Mike," Sarah pleaded, clutching his hand as the ambulance doors slammed shut. "Please, just stay with me." The sirens wailed as the ambulance sped through the streets of Santa Barbara. Inside, the paramedics worked feverishly, calling out vital signs and administering emergency treatment. Mike's grip on consciousness was slipping, the pain and blood loss taking their toll. "BP's dropping," one paramedic announced, his voice tense. "We're losing him." Sarah's face hovered above Mike, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't you dare leave me, Mike Peterson," she said fiercely. "We've been through too much together. You can't give up now." Mike wanted to reassure her, to tell her how much he loved her, but he couldn't find the strength to speak. The world was fading away, the sounds of the ambulance becoming distant and muffled. As consciousness slipped away, Mike's last thoughts were of the ocean, not of the terror and pain of the attack, but of the beauty and power he had always loved. The rhythm of the waves, the endless expanse of blue, the mystery of the depths. Even now, knowing the danger that lurked beneath the surface, a part of him still felt drawn to it. "We're here," a voice called out, snapping Mike back to awareness. The ambulance doors burst open, and he was rushed into the emergency room of Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. The world became a blur of bright lights, urgent voices, and hurried movement. Mike caught fragments of conversation as doctors assessed his injuries. Massive blood loss, possible internal injuries, need to get him into surgery immediately. As they prepared to move him to the operating room, Mike summoned the last of his strength to turn to Sarah. "I love you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whatever happens, remember that." Sarah leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I love you too," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Now fight, Mike, fight like hell to come back to me." As they wheeled him away, Mike closed his eyes, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. He had survived the ocean's most feared predator. Now he faced a different kind of battle, one that would test not just his body, but his will to live. The operating room doors swung shut, and Mike Peterson's fate hung in the balance. The long journey of recovery, of learning to live with the physical and emotional scars of his encounter, was just beginning. But for now, as the anesthesia took hold and consciousness faded away, Mike's world narrowed to a single thought: survive. For Sarah, for himself, for the chance to see another sunrise over the ocean he loved and feared in equal measure. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sun beat down mercilessly on Ledbetter Beach, its rays glinting off the deceptively calm surface of the Pacific Ocean. Julie Martinez stood at the lifeguard tower, her eyes scanning the water. With practiced vigilance, it was supposed to be a routine day, but an uneasy feeling had settled in her gut since her shift began. "Hey, Julie," a voice called from below. She looked down to see her colleague, Tom, approaching the tower. "Anything exciting happening up there?" Julie shook her head, her ponytail swaying with the movement. All quiet so far, almost too quiet, you know. Tom chuckled as he climbed up to join her. Don't say that, you'll jinx us. As if on cue, a distant shout caught their attention. Julie's head snapped towards the sound, her hand instinctively reaching for her binoculars. There, Tom pointed, his voice suddenly tense. About a half-mile out, is that... Oh God, is that a shark fin? Julie focused her binoculars, her breath catching in her throat as she spotted the telltale triangular shape cutting through the water. But it wasn't the fin that made her blood run cold. It was the small figure thrashing beside it. Shark attack, she yelled, already moving into action. Tom, radio the Coast Guard. I'm going out there. Tom's face paled. Julie, wait, you can't go alone. It's too dangerous. But Julie was already halfway down the tower, her training kicking in, overriding her fear. There's no time. That person needs help now. She sprinted across the beach, her feet kicking up sand as she ran towards the rescue boat. Beachgoers turned to watch, confusion and fear spreading across their faces as they realized something was wrong. Julie's hands shook as she untied the boat, her mind racing. In all her years as a lifeguard, she'd never had to deal with a shark attack. The danger was always there, lurking beneath the surface, but it had remained a distant threat until now. The boat's engine roared to life, and Julie steered it out into the open water. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of adrenaline and terror coursing through her veins. As she neared the site of the attack, the full horror of the situation became clear. A man was clinging desperately to an overturned kayak, his face a mask of pain and fear. The water around him was stained red, and the massive shape of a great white shark circled ominously nearby. Hold on, Julie shouted, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the engine and the man's panicked cries. I'm coming! As she drew closer, the shark suddenly surged forward, its enormous body breaching the surface as it lunged for the man. Julie's breath caught in her throat, a scream of helpless terror escaping her lips. But at the last second, the man managed to pull himself partially onto the kayak, the shark's jaws snapping shut just inches from his legs. The force of the impact sent him tumbling back into the water, and Julie knew she had only seconds to act. She gunned the engine, steering the boat directly between the shark and its intended prey. The hull scraped against the shark's rough skin, and Julie felt the boat shudder from the contact. Grab on, she yelled, extending a rescue buoy towards the man. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, but he managed to grasp the buoy with trembling hands. Julie began to pull him in, her muscles straining with the effort. But the shark wasn't giving up its prey so easily. It circled back, its dorsal fin cutting through the water as it approached for another attack. Come on, Julie muttered, willing the man to move faster. She could see the extent of his injuries now. Deep gashes along his side and leg, blood still flowing freely. Just as she managed to get a grip on the man's arm, the shark struck again. Its massive head rose from the water, jaws open wide, aiming directly for the boat. Julie reacted on instinct. She grabbed the flare gun from its holster and fired directly into the shark's gaping maw. The flare exploded in a burst of red light, and the shark recoiled, thrashing in the water before disappearing beneath the surface. With a final burst of strength, Julie hauled the injured man into the boat. He collapsed on the deck, his breathing ragged and shallow. Stay with me, Julie said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. What's your name? Mike, the man gasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her. Mike Peterson. Okay, Mike, you're going to be all right. I'm getting you to shore. As Julie turned the boat back towards the beach, she saw other rescue vessels approaching. The Coast Guard had arrived, their boats cutting swiftly through the waves. This is lifeguard Julie Martinez, she called into her radio. I have the victim, male, late 40s, severe lacerations to the torso and leg, requesting immediate medical assistance on shore. The trip back to the beach seemed to take an eternity. Julie kept one hand on the wheel and the other pressing a towel against Mike's wounds, trying to stem the bleeding. She could hear the wail of ambulance sirens growing louder as they neared the shore. My wife, Mike mumbled, his voice weak. Sarah, she warned me. We'll find her, Julie assured him, her eyes scanning the growing crowd on the beach. Just stay awake, Mike, stay with me. As they reached the shallows, a team of paramedics waded out to meet them. Julie helped them transfer Mike onto a backboard, her hands and arms now covered in his blood. The beach had erupted into chaos. Curious onlookers pressed forward, held back by police who had arrived on the scene. News cameras were already rolling, their lenses focused on the unfolding drama. Julie stumbled out of the boat, the adrenaline that had carried her through the rescue beginning to ebb. She watched as the paramedics rushed Mike across the sand towards a waiting ambulance. "Julie!" Tom's voice cut through the noise. He ran up to her, his face a mix of relief and concern. "Are you all right? That was... Jesus, I've never seen anything like it." Before she could respond, a woman's anguished cry rose above the commotion. "Mike, oh my God, Mike!" Julie turned to see a middle-aged woman pushing through the crowd, her face pale with shock. "That's my husband," she was shouting. "Please let me through." "Sarah," Julie murmured, remembering Mike's words. She moved quickly, intercepting the distraught woman before she could reach the ambulance. "Mrs. Peterson?" Julie asked gently. When Sarah nodded, her eyes wild with fear, Julie continued, "I'm Julie, the lifeguard who brought your husband in. He's alive, but he's badly injured. The paramedics are doing everything they can." Sarah gripped Julie's arms, her fingers digging in painfully. Is he going to be okay?" Julie wished she could offer more comfort, but she knew the severity of Mike's injuries. "He's fighting hard," she said instead. "He told me to find you. He loves you very much." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she watched the paramedics load Mike into the ambulance. "I told him not to go out today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a bad feeling." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped away, its sirens wailing, Julie felt the full weight of the day's events crash down upon her. She looked out at the ocean, its surface once again calm and inviting. But she knew the truth of what lurked beneath, the primal power and danger that could erupt at any moment. A Coast Guard officer approached, his notebook in hand. "Ms. Martinez, we need to get your statement about what happened out there." Julie nodded numbly, her mind still replaying the terrifying moments of the rescue. As she began to recount the events, she knew that this day would forever change her relationship with the ocean. The beach she had sworn to protect had revealed its darker side, and the memory of those razor-sharp teeth and cold, black eyes would haunt her for years to come. But as she spoke, Julie also felt a fierce pride in what she had accomplished. Against all odds, she had faced one of nature's most perfect predators and emerged victorious. Mike Peterson was alive because of her actions, and that knowledge gave her the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun began to set over Ledbetter Beach, casting a golden glow across the water. The day's terror had passed, but its impact would be felt for long after. And somewhere out there, beneath the waves, the great white shark continued its ancient patrol, a reminder of the wild and untamable heart of the ocean. The ambulance. Sirens wailed as it raced through the streets of Santa Barbara, carrying Mike Peterson's broken body towards salvation. Inside, paramedics worked feverishly to keep him alive, their voices a cacophony of urgent medical jargon. "BP's dropping, we're losing him," one paramedic shouted, his hands pressing down on Mike's wounds, trying to stem the relentless flow of blood. Sarah Peterson sat in the corner of the ambulance, her face ashen, watching in horror as her husband's life hung in the balance. "Please, Mike," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Please don't leave me." The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance of Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital. The doors burst open, and a team of doctors and nurses swarmed around the gurney. Shark attack victim, multiple lacerations to the torso and leg, severe blood loss, the lead paramedic reported as they rushed Mike through the sliding doors. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead trauma surgeon on duty, took one look at Mike and barked out orders. "Get him to OR1 stat. Type and cross for 6. Units of ONEG. We need to stop this bleeding now." As they wheeled Mike away, a nurse gently held Sarah back. "Ma'am, you need to wait here. We'll update you as soon as we can." Sarah watched helplessly as the doors swung shut behind them, cutting her off from Mike. She collapsed into a nearby chair, her body shaking with sobs. Meanwhile, in the operating room, Dr. Rodriguez and her team worked with practiced precision. The beep of the heart monitor provided a tense backdrop to their efforts. "Suction here," Dr. Rodriguez commanded, her eyes focused on the gaping wound in Mike's side. Jesus, look at the size of these tooth marks. What kind of shark are we dealing with? A younger surgeon, Dr. Tom Chang, looked up from where he was assisting. Heard it was a great white, 20 feet, maybe more. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head in disbelief. And he survived the initial attack? This guy's got one hell of a will to live. As they worked to repair the damage, Mike's vitals suddenly plummeted. The steady beep of the heart monitor gave way to a shrill, continuous tone. "He's coding," Dr. Chang yelled, "starting chest compressions." Dr. Rodriguez grabbed the defibrillator paddles. "Charge to 300, clear." Mike's body arched as the electricity coursed through him. For a moment there was no change. Then, miraculously, the monitor began to beep again. "We've got him back," Dr. Rodriguez said, relief evident in her voice. "But we're not out of the woods yet. Let's close him up and get him to ICU." Hours passed in a blur of tension and focused effort. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the OR, exhaustion etched on her face. She made her way to the waiting room, where Sarah sat, surrounded by friends who had come to offer support. "Mrs. Peterson," Dr. Rodriguez said softly. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wild with fear and hope. "How is he? Is Mike—" Dr. Rodriguez sat down next to her. "Your husband is alive," she began, and Sarah let out a sob of relief. "But his condition is critical. We've managed to repair the worst of the damage, but he's lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Sarah nodded, trying to process the information. "Can I see him? He's being moved to the ICU now. Once he's settled, you can sit with him for a few minutes, but I want to prepare you. He's on a ventilator, and there are a lot of machines and tubes. It can be overwhelming." True to the doctor's words, when Sarah first laid eyes on Mike in the ICU, she had to stifle a gasp. Her strong, vibrant husband looked small and fragile, swallowed up by the hospital bed, and the array of medical equipment surrounding him. Sarah approached slowly, her hand reaching out to gently touch Mike's. His skin felt cool and clammy beneath her fingers. "Oh, Mike," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here, honey. I'm right here. You need to fight, okay? Fight to come back to me." As Sarah kept vigil by Mike's bedside, life outside the hospital walls continued its frenzied pace. News of the shark attack spread quickly, dominating local headlines and sparking intense debate about beach safety. At the Santa Barbara Marine Institute, marine biologist Dr. Samantha Lee found herself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters clamored for her expert opinion on the attack. "Dr. Lee, is it common for great white sharks to come so close to shore in this area?" a journalist asked, shoving a microphone in her face. Samantha took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "While it's not unheard of, an attack of this magnitude is extremely rare. Great whites typically prefer cooler waters and are not usually found this far south, especially so close to shore." "Then why did this happen?" another reporter pressed. "Is climate change affecting shark migration patterns?" "It's possible," Samantha admitted. "Changes in ocean temperatures and prey distribution could be factors. But it's important to remember that sharks are not mindless killing machines. They don't actively seek out humans as prey." Back at the hospital, Mike's condition remained critical but stable. Sarah refused to leave his side, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair by his bed. Friends and family came and went, offering support and bringing food that went largely uneaten. On the third day after the attack, as Sarah dozed fitfully in her chair, a slight movement caught her attention. She looked up to see Mike's fingers, twitching slightly. "Mike," she said, hope surging through her. "Mike, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. For a moment, his gaze was unfocused, then his eyes locked onto Sarah's face. "Sarah," he managed to croak out, his voice hoarse from the ventilator tube that had only recently been removed. Tears of joy streamed down Sarah's face as she pressed the call button for the nurse. "I'm here, honey. You're okay. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be all right." Mike's brow furrowed as memories of the attack came flooding back. "The shark," he whispered, fear evident in his voice. "It was so big. I thought—" "Shh," Sarah soothed, stroking his hair. "You're safe now. You fought so hard, Mike. You came back to me." Dr. Rodriguez entered the room, a smile breaking across her tired face when she saw Mike was awake. "Welcome back, Mr. Peterson. You gave us quite a scare." As the doctor checked Mike's vitals and explained his condition, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The road to recovery would be long and difficult, but Mike was alive. They had been given a second chance. Over the next few days, as Mike grew stronger, he was able to give his account of the attack to the authorities. Officer Jake Martinez of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife listened intently, jotting notes in his notebook. "And you're certain about the size of the shark?" Officer Martinez asked, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Mike nodded, a shudder running through him at the memory. "At least 20 feet. Maybe more. I've been kayaking these waters for years, but I've never seen anything like it." Officer Martinez whistled low. "That's a monster, all right. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Peterson." As word of Mike's recovery spread, media interest in the story intensified. Requests for interviews poured in, but Sarah fiercely protected Mike's privacy, allowing him to focus on healing. One afternoon, as Mike was working through his physical therapy exercises, a knock at the door interrupted them. Julie Martinez, the lifeguard who had saved Mike's life, stood in the doorway looking uncertain. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said hesitantly. I wanted to see how you were doing." Mike's face lit up with recognition. "Julie, please, come in. I've been hoping to thank you properly." As Julie entered the room, Mike reached out to clasp her hand. "I owe you my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did out there, I don't have words." Julie blushed, shaking her head. "I was just doing my job. I'm so glad you're recovering." The three of them talked for a while, recounting the events of that terrifying day from their different perspectives. As Julie prepared to leave, Mike called out to her, "Julie, wait, I need to ask you something." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The ocean. Do you think I'll ever be able to go back?" Julie considered the question carefully. "The ocean is powerful and sometimes dangerous," she said slowly. "But it's also beautiful and life-giving. I think when you're ready, you'll find your way back to it, on your own terms." As Julie left, Mike turned to Sarah, a mix of fear and determination in his eyes. "She's right," he said softly. "I can't let this beat me. Someday, somehow, I need to face the water again." Sarah squeezed his hand, her love and support evident in her touch. "And when that day comes, I'll be right there with you," she promised. Outside the hospital window, the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The ocean stretched out to the horizon, its surface calm and inviting. But beneath those peaceful waters, life and death played out in an eternal dance, a reminder of the wild and untamable heart of nature. For Mike Peterson, the journey of recovery was just beginning. The physical scars would heal, but the emotional ones would take time. Yet with each passing day, as he grew stronger and more determined, Mike knew that he would not let fear define him. The ocean had nearly taken his life, but it had also given him a new appreciation for the preciousness of each moment. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Mike drifted off to sleep, Sarah's hand clasped tightly in his, and for the first time since the attack, his dreams were not of terror and teeth, but of gentle waves and the promise of dawn. The harsh fluorescent lights of Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital's intensive care unit cast a pale glow over Mike Peterson's still form. The rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen provided a constant backdrop to the hushed voices of medical staff moving efficiently through the ward. Sarah Peterson sat vigilantly by her husband's bedside, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and countless tears shed. She held Mike's hand gently, careful not to disturb the IV lines and monitoring equipment attached to him. "Come on, Mike," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's time to wake up. Please just open your eyes." As if in response to her plea, Mike's eyelids fluttered. Sarah leaned forward, hope surging through her exhausted body. "Mike, can you hear me?" Slowly, painfully, Mike's eyes opened. For a moment, they darted around in confusion, before finally focusing on Sarah's face. "Sarah?" His voice was barely audible, rough from disuse and the recently removed breathing tube. Tears of relief spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Yes, honey, I'm here. You're in the hospital. You're safe now. Mike's brow furrowed as fragmented memories began to surface. The shark, it was so big, I thought. Shh, Sarah soothed, stroking his hair. Don't try to talk too much. You've been through a terrible ordeal, but you're going to be okay. A nurse entered the room, alerted by the change in Mike's vital signs. Her face broke into a smile when she saw he was awake. Welcome back, Mr. Peterson. I'll page Dr. Rodriguez right away. As the nurse busied herself checking Mike's vitals, Sarah continued to murmur words of comfort and reassurance. Mike's eyes never left her face, as if she were an anchor in a world that had suddenly become frighteningly unfamiliar. Dr. Elena Rodriguez strode into the room, her white coat flaring behind her. Despite the late hour, she looked alert and focused. Mr. Peterson, it's good to see you awake. How are you feeling? Mike swallowed hard before answering. Like I've been hit by a truck, or eaten by a shark. Dr. Rodriguez's lips quirked in a small smile. Well, your sense of humor seems intact, which is a good sign. Do you remember what happened? Mike closed his eyes, his face contorting as he recalled the attack. I was in my kayak, fishing. The shark came out of nowhere. It was massive. Like nothing I've ever seen before. Dr. Rodriguez nodded, making notes on Mike's chart. You've suffered significant injuries, Mr. Peterson. Multiple lacerations to your torso and left leg, severe blood loss, and some internal injuries. We had to perform emergency surgery when you were brought in. Mike listened, his face paling as the full extent of his injuries became clear. Sarah squeezed his hand supportively. The good news, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is that you're stable now and your vitals are improving. You have a long recovery ahead of you, but given the circumstances, you're incredibly fortunate. When can I go home? Mike asked, his voice stronger now. Dr. Rodriguez's expression turned serious. Not for a while, I'm afraid. You'll need to stay in the ICU for at least a few more days, and then we'll move you to a regular room. After that, you're looking at several weeks of inpatient rehabilitation. Mike's face fell, but Sarah leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. We'll get through this together, Mike, one day at a time. As the days passed, Mike's condition slowly improved. The fog of pain medication began to lift, allowing him to engage more with his surroundings and visitors. Friends and family came by regularly, offering support and bringing news from the outside world. One afternoon, as Mike was working through some basic physical therapy exercises in his bed, there was a knock at the door. Officer Jake Martinez from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife entered, notebook in hand. Mr. Peterson, I'm Officer Martinez. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about the attack if you're feeling up to it. Mike nodded, gesturing for the officer to take a seat. Sarah, ever present, moved to stand protectively by Mike's side. Officer. Martinez flipped open his notebook. Can you walk me through what happened that day? Any details you can remember would be helpful. Mike took a deep breath, steeling himself. I went out early, around 6 a.m. The water was calm, perfect for kayaking. I paddled out maybe half a mile offshore near Ledbetter Point. That's when I noticed something odd. Odd how? Officer Martinez prompted. The fish, they were acting strange, darting around erratically. And then I saw this shadow pass under my kayak. It was huge, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Mike's voice grew strained as he continued, reliving the terrifying moments. Before I could even process what was happening, the shark breached. It came straight up out of the water, jaws wide open. I remember thinking it looked like a submarine. It was so big. Officer Martinez's eyebrows shot up. Can you estimate the size? Mike closed his eyes, visualizing the monster that had nearly killed him. At least 20 feet long, maybe more. Its mouth, God, it looked like it could swallow me whole. The officer whistled low. That's a true monster, Mr. Peterson. Great. Whites that size are extremely rare. As Mike finished recounting the attack, his voice shaking, Sarah wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Officer Martinez jotted down a few final notes before closing his notebook. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. This information will be crucial for our investigation and for updating our shark monitoring protocols. He paused, his expression softening. And for what it's worth, you're one hell of a survivor. Not many people could go through what you did and live to tell the tale. After Officer Martinez left, Mike slumped back against his pillows, exhausted from reliving the traumatic experience. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers soothingly through his hair. "You did great, honey," she murmured. "I know how hard that must have been." Mike looked at her, his eyes haunted. "Sarah, I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back in the water. The thought of it terrifies me." Sarah took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You don't have to think about that now. Right now, all you need to focus on is getting better. We'll face everything else together, when you're ready." As the days turned into weeks, Mike's physical recovery progressed steadily. The wounds began to heal, leaving angry red scars that would forever mark his brush with death. But the emotional scars ran deeper, manifesting in nightmares that left him thrashing and shouting in his sleep. Dr. Amelia Chen, the hospital's psychologist, became a regular visitor. Her calm demeanor and gentle guidance helped Mike begin to process the trauma he had experienced. "It's normal to feel fear and anxiety after what you've been through," Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions. "The key is not to let that fear control you." Mike nodded, fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. "I know that logically, but every time I close my eyes, I see those teeth coming at me. I feel the pain, the terror. It's like I'm right back there in the water." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her voice compassionate but firm. "Mike, you survived something incredibly traumatic. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be angry. What's important is that you don't let those feelings define you. You're more than what happened to you." As Mike worked through his physical and emotional recovery, the world outside the hospital continued to react to the attack. Local beaches implemented stricter safety measures, and marine biologists debated the reasons behind the unusually aggressive behavior of such a large shark so close to shore. Dr. Samantha Lee, a prominent marine biologist, found herself in high demand for interviews and expert commentary. She stood on the beach near where the attack had occurred, surrounded by a swarm of reporters and camera crews. "Dr. Lee, does this attack indicate an increasing danger to beachgoers?" one journalist shouted. Samantha took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "It's important to remember that shark attacks, especially of this magnitude, are extremely rare. While we take this incident very seriously and are implementing additional safety measures, we must also respect that the ocean is the shark's natural habitat," another reporter pushed forward. "But what about the size of the shark? Surely that's unusual." "You're right," Samantha nodded. "Her great white of the size described by Mr. Peterson is indeed rare, especially in these waters. We're conducting thorough research to understand what might have brought such a large predator so close to shore." As the days passed and Mike grew stronger, he began to contemplate the future. The thought of returning to his old life, of going back out on the water, filled him with dread. But he also felt a deep-seated need to reclaim some part of what he had lost. One evening, as Sarah helped him take a slow, painful walk down the hospital corridor, Mike turned to her with determination in his eyes. "I want to see the ocean," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Are you sure?" "Mike, you don't have to push yourself." He shook his head. "I'm not ready to go in, not even close, but I need to see it. I need to know I can look at it without falling apart." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. She nodded, squeezing his hand. "Okay, when you're strong enough, we'll go, together." As the sun set over Santa Barbara, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Mike stood at the window of his hospital room. In the distance, he could just make out the glimmer of the Pacific Ocean on the horizon. It looked peaceful, beautiful even, belying the danger that lurked beneath its surface. Mike placed his hand on the cool glass, his reflection staring back at him, a man forever changed by his encounter with nature's most perfect predator. The scars on his body were healing, but the scars on his psyche ran deep. Yet as he gazed out at the distant waters, a tiny spark of his old love for the ocean flickered to life. "I'll be back," he whispered, more to himself than to the sea. "Someday, somehow I'll find my way back to you." Behind him, Sarah watched silently, her heart swelling with love and admiration for her husband's courage. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, both Mike and Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the future, a future they would face together, one day at a time. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Mike Peterson's hospital room, casting long shadows across the sterile floor. Mike sat on the edge of his bed, his legs dangling over the side, feet not quite touching the ground. He stared at his reflection in the mirror opposite, barely recognizing the man who looked back at him. The door creaked open, and Sarah entered, a forced smile on her tired face. "Ready for the big day?" she asked, her voice overly cheerful. Mike nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving his reflection. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." Today was the day. After weeks of surgeries, physical therapy, and psychological counseling, Mike was finally being discharged. The prospect of leaving the safety of the hospital filled him with a mixture of relief and dread. Dr. Elena Rodriguez entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson. How are we feeling today?" Mike turned to face her, wincing, slightly as the movement pulled at his still healing wounds. "Nervous," he admitted, "but ready to go home." Dr. Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "That's perfectly normal. Remember, your recovery doesn't end when you leave here. You'll need to continue with your physical therapy and counseling sessions. And don't hesitate to reach out if you experience any complications or increased pain." As Dr. Rodriguez went through the discharge paperwork, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. The door burst open, and a whirlwind of energy in the form of Mike and Sarah's daughter, Emma, rushed in. "Dad!" Emma cried, throwing her arms around Mike. He stifled a grunt of pain, not wanting to dampen her enthusiasm. "Easy there, kiddo," Sarah cautioned, gently pulling Emma back. "Remember, Dad's still healing." Emma stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Sorry, Dad. I'm just so excited you're coming home." Mike managed a small smile, reaching out to squeeze his daughter's hand. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." As they made their way out of the hospital, Mike leaning heavily on a cane, he couldn't help but notice the stares and whispers from other patients and visitors. News of his survival had spread far and wide, turning him into something of a local celebrity, a role he was far from comfortable with. Outside, the California sun beat down mercilessly. Mike squinted, shielding his eyes with his free hand. After weeks in the dimly lit hospital, the brightness was almost painful. "Do you want to stop by the beach on the way home?" Sarah asked hesitantly as they approached the car. "Just to see it." Mike felt his heart rate spike at the mere mention of the ocean. He shook his head firmly. "Not today. I'm not ready for that yet." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, let's just get you home." The drive was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest suburban home, Mike felt a lump form in his throat. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he had left for what was supposed to be a routine fishing trip. Inside, Mike was surprised to find a small gathering of friends and family waiting to welcome him home. Their faces were a mixture of joy and concern. Unsure of how to act around him, his best friend Tom stepped forward, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "Welcome home, buddy, we've missed you." Mike nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Tom, it's good to be back." As the afternoon wore on, Mike found himself growing increasingly overwhelmed. The constant stream of well wishes, the barrage of questions about his experience, the looks of pity, it was all too much. Finally, sensing his distress, Sarah began ushering people out. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "But Mike needs to rest now." When the last guest had left, Mike slumped onto the couch, exhaustion etched on his face. Sarah sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You did great," she said softly. "I know that wasn't easy," Mike sighed heavily. I don't know how to be around people anymore. Everyone wants to talk about the attack, but I can barely think about it without panicking." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's going to take time, Mike. You've been through something unimaginable. No one expects you to just bounce back." As night fell, Mike found himself standing at the bedroom window, staring out at the darkened street. In the distance, he could just make out the faint shimmer of moonlight on the ocean. A shiver ran down his spine. "Dad?" Emma's voice came from behind him. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, a concerned look on her young face. "Are you okay?" Mike managed a small smile. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking. Emma moved, to stand beside him, following his gaze out the window. Do you think you'll ever go back in the water? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mike was silent for a long moment before answering. I don't know, Emma. Right now. The thought terrifies me. But maybe someday. Emma leaned her head against his arm. It's okay if you don't. We can find other things to do together. Mike felt a rush of love for his daughter, marveling at her maturity and understanding. He wrapped an arm around her, shoulders pulling her close. Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me. As Emma said goodnight and headed to her room, Sarah appeared in the doorway. Everything okay? She asked softly. Mike nodded, turning back to the window. Just talking with Emma. She's worried about me. Sarah moved to stand beside him, wrapping an arm around his waist. We all are, Mike, but we're here for you every step of the way. That night, as Mike lay in bed, the familiar nightmares returned. He thrashed in his sleep, reliving the terror of the attack. In his dream, he could feel the shark's teeth tearing into his flesh, could see its cold black eyes staring at him as it pulled him under. He woke with a start, gasping for air, his body covered in a cold sweat. Sarah was there instantly, her arms around him, murmuring words of comfort. It's okay, Mike, you're safe. It was just a dream. But it wasn't just a dream, and they both knew it. It was a memory, one that would haunt Mike for a long time to come. The next morning, as Mike sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking, a knock at the door startled him from his reverie. Sarah answered it, returning moments later with a familiar face in tow. It was Julie Martinez, the lifeguard who had saved Mike's life. I hope I'm not intruding, Julie said hesitantly. I just wanted to see how you were doing. Mike gestured for her to sit, a mix of emotions playing across his face. Julie, I don't know how to thank you. What you did that day, so Julie shook her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I was just doing my job, Mr. Peterson. I'm just glad I was able to help. They talked for a while, Julie filling Mike in on the changes that had been implemented at the beach since his attack. Increased patrols, new warning systems, more stringent safety protocols. As Julie prepared to leave, she hesitated, then turned back to Mike. Mr. Peterson, I know this might be hard to hear, but the ocean isn't the enemy. What happened to you was terrible, but it's also incredibly rare. I hope that someday you'll be able to find joy in the water again. Mike nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As the door closed behind Julie, he turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I want to go to the beach, he said quietly. Not in the water, not yet. But I need to see it. I need to face it. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded. Okay, we can do that, whenever you're ready. The next day, as the sun began to set, Mike found himself standing at the edge of Ledbetter Beach, leaning heavily on his cane. Sarah stood beside him, a steady presence at his side. The ocean stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and terrifying, and Mike could feel his heart racing, his palms sweating as he stared out at the waves. It looked so peaceful, he murmured. Hard to believe what's lurking beneath the surface. Sarah squeezed his hand. Are you okay? Do you want to leave? Mike shook his head, his jaw set with determination. No, I need to do this. I need to know I can look at it without falling apart. As they stood there watching the sun sink lower in the sky, Mike felt a strange mix of emotions wash over him. Fear, yes, but also a faint glimmer of the love he had once felt for the ocean. I don't know if I'll ever go back in, he said softly, but I won't let it control me. I won't let the fear win. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm so proud of you, Mike. This is a big step. As darkness fell and the first stars began to appear in the sky, Mike took one last look at the ocean before turning away. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was no longer alone in his struggle. With Sarah by his side and the support of his family and friends, Mike knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ocean had nearly taken his life, but it had also given him a new appreciation for the preciousness of each moment. As they walked away from the beach, Mike felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't healed, not by a long shot, but he had taken the first step on the long journey to reclaiming his life. And somewhere out there, beneath the waves, life went on. The great white that had attacked Mike continued its ancient patrol, a reminder of the wild and untamable heart of nature. But for Mike Peterson, that reminder no longer held the power to paralyze him with fear. He had survived, he had endured, and he would continue to do so, one day at a time. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine sands of Ledbetter Beach as a group of officials from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife made their way along the shoreline. Their faces were grim, their movements purposeful, as they surveyed the area where just weeks ago Mike Peterson had nearly lost his life in a horrific shark attack. Leading the group was Dr. Samantha Lee, a marine biologist specializing in shark behavior. Her keen eyes scanned the water's edge, searching for any signs that might shed light on the unusual incident. "Dr. Lee," called out one of her colleagues, a young man named Alex. "I've got something here." Samantha hurried over, her heart racing with anticipation. Alex pointed to a set of unusual markings in the sand just above the tide line. "What do you make of this?" he asked, his voice hushed. Samantha crouched down, studying the marks intently. After a moment, she stood, shaking her head. "It's not related to our investigation, probably just some kids playing in the sand." A hint of disappointment crossed Alex's face, but he nodded, continuing his search along the beach. As the team worked, a small crowd of onlookers began to gather. News of the investigation had spread quickly through the tight-knit coastal community, and curiosity had drawn many to the scene. Among the spectators was Julie Martinez, the lifeguard who had rescued Mike Peterson. She stood apart from the others, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the officials at work. The events of that day still haunted her. The memory of Mike's blood-stained body seared into her mind. One of the Fish and Wildlife officers approached Julie, notepad in hand. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Officer Jake Thompson. I was hoping I could ask you a few more questions about the day of the attack." Julie nodded, her posture stiffening slightly. "Of course, what do you need to know?" As Officer Thompson began his questioning, Dr. Lee's voice rang out across the beach. "Everyone gather round. I want to go over our findings so far." The team assembled, joined by a few curious onlookers who edged closer to hear what the expert had to say. "Based on our analysis and Mr. Peterson's account," Samantha began, her voice clear and authoritative, "we're dealing with an unusually large great white shark, likely a female given its size. The estimated length of 20 feet or more puts it in the upper range of known great white specimens." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Samantha continued, "What's particularly unusual is the aggressive nature of the attack. Great whites, typically, don't view humans as prey. Most attacks are investigatory, a single bite followed by release. This level of sustained aggression is extremely rare. So what caused it?" Alex asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Samantha sighed, running a hand through her wind-tousled hair. "That's what we're here to figure out. We're looking at several factors: changes in water temperature, shifts in prey distribution, possible contamination that might have affected the shark's behavior. But at this point, we have more questions than answers." As the team dispersed to continue their investigation, Julie found herself approached by a local news reporter, microphone in hand. "Ms. Martinez, can you tell us about the moment you realized Mr. Peterson was in danger?" the reporter asked, her cameraman zooming in on Julie's face. Julie hesitated, the memories flooding back. I heard a shout. When I looked out, I saw the fin. It was massive, like nothing I'd ever seen before. And then I saw Mike clinging to his overturned kayak. There was so much blood in the water." Her voice trailed off, and the reporter quickly jumped in. "You risked your own life to save him. Do you consider yourself a hero?" Julie shook her head emphatically. "No, absolutely not. I was just doing my job. The real hero is Mike, his will to survive. That's what saved him." As the day wore on, the investigation continued. Water samples were taken, sonar equipment was deployed to scan the ocean floor, and eyewitness accounts were meticulously recorded. But despite their best efforts, concrete answers remained elusive. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the water, Dr. Lee called her team together for a final briefing. "While we haven't found any smoking gun," she began, her voice tinged with frustration. "We have gathered valuable data that will help us better understand and prevent incidents like this in the future. I want to thank you all for your hard work. Today." As the officials packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, a commotion near the parking lot caught everyone's attention. A car had pulled up, and from it emerged Mike Peterson, leaning heavily on a cane with Sarah at his side. A hush fell over the beach as Mike made his way slowly towards the water's edge. The crowd parted before him, murmurs of sympathy and awe. Following in his wake, Dr. Lee approached him cautiously. "Mr. Peterson, I'm Dr. Samantha Lee. We weren't expecting you here today." Mike's eyes never left the ocean as he spoke. "I needed to come, to see it, to try to understand." Samantha nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. Mr. Peterson, I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to understand what happened that day and to prevent it from happening again." Mike finally turned to look at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "And what have you found? Why did it attack me? Why did it keep coming back when most sharks would have left after the first bite?" Samantha hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The truth is, Mr. Peterson, we don't know for certain. Shark behavior, especially in cases like this, is complex and not fully understood. What we do know is that this was an extremely rare event. The chances of something like this happening again are incredibly small." Mike laughed bitterly. "Tell that to the part of me that was left in that shark's stomach." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his arm, but Mike shrugged it off, taking a few halting steps towards the water. "Mike," Sarah said softly, worry evident in her voice. "Maybe this is too much. We can come back another day." But Mike shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "No, I need to do this. I need to face it." As the gathered crowd watched in hushed anticipation, Mike continued his slow journey towards the water's edge. Each step seemed to require immense effort, both physical and mental. Finally, he stood at the very brink, the gentle waves lapping at his feet. Mike stared out at the vast expanse of the Pacific, his body trembling slightly. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of the waves and the distant cry of seagulls. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mike began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the beach. "I've loved the ocean all my life," he said, his words seeming to come from some deep, wounded place within him. "I've respected its power, marveled at its beauty, but now I know its terror too." He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "That day, when the shark attacked, I saw death coming for me. I felt its teeth tearing into me, felt my life slipping away in the cold water. And in that moment, I hated the ocean with every fiber of my being." Sarah moved to stand beside him, silent tears streaming down her face as she listened to her husband bare his soul. "But standing here now," Mike went on, his voice growing stronger, "I realize something. The ocean isn't good or evil, it's not out to get me, it's just wild, untamable. And that shark, as terrifying as it was just being what nature made it to be." He turned to face the crowd, his eyes shining with a mix of fear and something that looked almost like wonder. "I don't know if I'll ever go back in the water. The thought of it still terrifies me, but I won't let that fear control me. I won't let it take away the love I've always had for this place." As Mike finished speaking, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Julie Martinez stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and embraced him gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "for your courage, for your forgiveness." Dr. Lee approached next, a look of profound respect on her face. "Mr. Peterson, would you consider working with us? Your experience, your perspective, it could be invaluable in our research and in educating the public about shark behavior and ocean safety." Mike looked surprised for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think I'd like that. If it can help prevent someone else from going through what I did." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the crowd began to disperse. Mike remained at the water's edge, Sarah's arm around his waist, supporting him. "Are you ready to go home?" she asked softly. Mike took one last look at the darkening ocean before nodding. "Yeah, I think I am," as they made their way back to the Mike leaned heavily on his cane, each step a reminder of how close he had come to death. But there was a new lightness in his movements, as if some great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The investigation into the attack would continue. Questions would remain unanswered. But for Mike Peterson, this day marked a turning point. He had faced his fears, confronted the source of his nightmares, and emerged stronger for it. As they drove home in the gathering darkness, Sarah reached over and squeezed Mike's hand. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Mike smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in weeks. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." And as the lights of Santa Barbara twinkled to life around them, Mike felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but he no longer faced it alone. With Sarah by his side, and with a newfound purpose in helping others understand and respect the ocean, Mike knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The shark that had nearly taken his life continued its silent patrol beneath the waves, an apex predator honed by millions of years of evolution. But it no longer held the power to paralyze Mike with fear. He had survived, he had endured, and in doing so he had reclaimed not just his life, but his love for the wild, unpredictable beauty of the sea. As they pulled into their driveway, Mike took one last look in the direction of the ocean. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face, but for tonight he was content. He was home, he was alive, and that, he realized, was enough. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Mike Peterson's living room, casting a warm glow on the man seated in a comfortable armchair. Mike's eyes were closed, his breathing slow and deliberate as he listened to the soothing voice of Dr. Amelia Chen, his therapist. "Now, Mike, I want you to visualize the ocean," Dr. Chen said, softly. "Not as it was on the day of the attack, but as you remember it from before. The calm waters, the gentle waves, can you see it?" Mike nodded slightly, his brow furrowing with concentration. "I can," he murmured. It's beautiful." "Good," Dr. Chen encouraged. "Now I want you to imagine yourself standing at the water's edge. The sand beneath your feet, the breeze on your face. How does it feel?" For a moment Mike was silent, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Then, slowly, he relaxed. "It feels okay. I'm not panicking." "That's new." Dr. Chen smiled, though Mike couldn't see it with his eyes closed. "That's excellent progress, Mike. Now let's try something a little more challenging. I want you to imagine taking a step into the water, just one step. Can you do that for me?" Mike's breathing quickened slightly, but he nodded. "I'll try." As Mike worked through the visualization exercise, Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride and love for her husband. The past few months had been a grueling journey of physical and emotional healing, but moments like this gave her hope. After the session ended and Dr. Chen had left, Sarah joined Mike in the living room. "How are you feeling?" she asked, perching on the arm of his chair. Mike reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Better, I think. It's still hard, but I'm getting there." Sarah leaned down to kiss his forehead. "I'm so proud of you." "Mike, you've come so far." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. "Mom? Dad? I'm home!" called out Emma's voice. Mike smiled as their daughter bounded into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 16, Emma was a whirlwind of energy and enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the quiet that had settled over their home in the months following the attack. "How was school, sweetheart?" Mike asked, genuinely interested. Focusing on Emma's life and experiences had become a welcome distraction from his own struggles. Emma flopped onto the couch, her face lighting up. "It was great. Mr. Ramirez announced that we're doing a marine biology unit next month. I was wondering if you might come speak to our class, Dad." The room fell silent. Sarah held her breath, watching Mike carefully for his reaction. For a moment his face was unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You know what? I think I'd like that," Mike said softly. Emma's eyes widened. "Really? You mean it?" Mike nodded, his smile growing more confident. "Yeah, I do. It's time I started using my experience to educate others. Dr. Lee from Fish and Wildlife has been asking me to get involved in their outreach programs." This seems like a good place to start. Sarah squeezed Mike's shoulder, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pride. That's wonderful, Mike. I think it'll be good for you and for the students. As Emma chatted excitedly about the upcoming unit, Mike found himself actually looking forward to the opportunity. It was a small step, but an important one on his path to reclaiming his life and his passion for the ocean. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Mike worked closely with Dr. Lee to develop a presentation that balanced his personal experience with factual information about shark behavior and ocean safety. The process was challenging, forcing Mike to confront his memories of the attack in new ways, but it was also surprisingly cathartic. On the morning of the presentation, Mike stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his collar. The scars on his torso were hidden beneath his shirt, but he knew they were there. A permanent reminder of his brush with death. Sarah appeared behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You ready for this?" Mike took a deep breath, meeting her eyes in the reflection. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to Emma's high school was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into the parking lot, Mike felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. Maybe this was a mistake, he muttered, his hand on the door handle. Sarah reached over, placing her hand on his arm. "Mike, look at me." When he turned, she continued, "You can do this. Your story is powerful, and these kids need to hear it. But if it gets to be too much, you can stop at any time, okay?" Mike nodded, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "Okay, let's do this." As they walked into the school, Emma met them in the hallway, practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, I'm so glad you're here. Everyone's really looking forward to your talk." Mike managed to smile, ruffling his daughter's hair affectionately. "Thanks, sweetie, lead the way." The classroom fell silent as Mike entered, all eyes turning to him. He recognized the mix of curiosity and apprehension on the students' faces, the same look he'd seen countless times since the attack. Mr. Ramirez, Emma's teacher, stepped forward to shake his hand. "Mr. Peterson, thank you so much for coming." "We're honored to have you here," Mike nodded, moving to the front of the room. As he turned to face the class, he caught sight of Sarah slipping into a seat at the back, giving him an encouraging smile. "Good morning, everyone," Mike began, his voice steadier than he felt. "As you probably know, my name is Mike Peterson. A little over 6 months ago, I survived a shark attack off the coast of Santa Barbara." A ripple of whispers ran through the class. Mike took a deep breath and continued, "I'm here today to share my experience with you, but more importantly to help you understand these magnificent creatures and the vital role they play in our oceans." As Mike delved into his presentation, he found himself relaxing. He talked about his lifelong love of the ocean, the events leading up to the attack, and the terrifying moments when he thought his life was over. The students listened in rapt attention, their eyes wide. "I won't lie to you," Mike said, his voice growing serious. "The attack was the most horrifying experience of my life. For a long time afterward, I was angry, I was scared. I thought I'd never be able to look at the ocean again without feeling panic." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces before him. "But as I've worked through my recovery, I've come to realize something important. The shark that attacked me wasn't evil. It wasn't targeting me specifically. It was simply being what nature designed it to be. An apex predator, perfectly evolved for its environment." Mike clicked to the next slide, showing a beautiful underwater shot of a great white shark. "These animals have been swimming in our oceans for millions of years. They play a crucial role in maintaining the balance of marine ecosystems. And the truth is, attacks on humans are incredibly rare." For the next hour, Mike talked about shark behavior, conservation efforts, and the importance of respecting the ocean. He shared statistics, dispelled myths, and even managed to inject some humor into his presentation. By the time he opened the floor for questions, the initial tension in the room had dissipated entirely. Hands shot up across the classroom. Mike called on a boy in the front row. "Mr. Peterson, do you think you'll ever go back in the ocean?" The question hung in the air, and Mike was aware of Emma and Sarah both watching him intently. He took a moment before answering. "To be honest, I'm not sure," he said slowly. "The thought of it still scares me, but I'm working on it. I've started by just standing at the water's edge, feeling the waves on my feet. Maybe someday I'll be ready to go further. The important thing is I'm not letting my fear control me anymore. As the Q&A session continued, Mike found himself energized by the students' curiosity and engagement. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, there was a collective groan of disappointment. Mr. Ramirez stepped forward, beaming. "Thank you so much, Mr. Peterson. This has been incredibly informative and inspiring." As the students filed out, many of them stopped to shake Mike's hand or thank him personally. Emma hung back, waiting until the room had cleared before approaching. Her father. "Dad, that was amazing," she said, her eyes shining. "I'm so proud of you." Mike pulled her into a hug, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, sweetheart, that means a lot." Sarah joined them, wrapping her arms around both Mike and Emma. "You did wonderfully, Mike. How do you feel?" Mike took a moment to consider the question. "I feel good, really good, actually, like I've taken another step forward." As they left the school, Mike found himself looking towards the coast, visible in the distance. The sight of the ocean no longer filled him with pure dread. There was still fear, yes, but it was tempered now with something else, a rekindling of the love and respect he'd always held for the sea. "You know," he said slowly, "I think I'd like to go to the beach this weekend, not to go in the water," he added quickly, seeing Sarah's surprised expression. "Just to sit on the sand, maybe do some sketching. Would you both be up for that?" Emma's face lit up. "Really? Oh, Dad, that would be awesome." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Mike. We'll be right there with you." As they drove home, Mike felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road to recovery stretched out before him, still long and challenging, but no longer insurmountable. He had faced one of his greatest fears today, standing in front of that classroom, and had come out stronger for it. The shark that had attacked him was still out there somewhere, patrolling the depths of the Pacific. But it no longer held the power to define Mike's life. He was more than a victim, more than a survivor. He was a husband, a father, an educator, and an advocate for the very creatures that had nearly taken his life. As the California coastline stretched out beside them, bathed in the warm afternoon sun, Mike allowed himself to imagine a future where he might once again find joy in the water. It was a distant dream, but for the first time in months, it felt like a possibility. "Thank you," he said softly, glancing at Sarah and Emma, "for everything. For believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Sarah reached over, taking his hand. "Always, Mike. We're in this together, remember?" Mike nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer facing it alone. With his family by his side and a newfound purpose in educating others, Mike knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The ocean had nearly taken his life, but in surviving he had found a new depth to his strength, his relationships, and his understanding of the wild, beautiful world around him. As they turned onto their street, Mike took one last look at the distant shimmer of the Pacific. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to face, but for now he was content. He was healing, he was alive, and that, he realized, was more than enough.